All right, friends, we are together for another episode of Unedited. We've got Pastor Dimitri, we've got Pastor Drew, Pastor Bubba, and this is just like a 20-minute rant where we talk about a topic, and we don't even know where it's going to go. We'll see where it goes. Today, we're talking about culture and how to, engage with culture as a Christian. Yeah. Okay, so let me to set this up. I'll set this up for us. I think will help a little bit. When it comes to culture, typically there are two extremes. When it comes to the way that Christians approach culture, one extreme is, everything in culture is bad. Therefore, as a Christian, I must remove myself fully, completely, totally from culture and have nothing to do with it. So complete and total, not just rejection, but isolation from. Mm-hmm. The other extreme is, nothing's really bad in culture. Everything's fine with culture. And then as a Christian, not only do I embrace what's going on in culture, I become what's going on in culture. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So we see these kind of two extremes, rejecting everything about culture, embracing everything about culture. Let's talk a little bit about these extremes. Why do these extremes not work? Thoughts?
I think my first thought is that they just fail to account for kind of the whole story of reality. Like if you think about accepting everything as is, face value, all of it's fine. Well, we're failing to account for the fallenness of the humans that have created culture. We can't just look at anything and think for a moment that it's untouched by sin, brokenness, malicious intent, mistakes. It's not necessarily that everything is like malicious and out to get us and destroy us, but like sometimes just like someone made a bad choice at some point and got off track. On the other hand, I think looking and saying everything is bad fails to account for just general revelation and just the general grace of God. And saying like, even people who don't know God, don't believe in God, are still created in the image of God and have some amount of reflection. And so I think either way we go, we're just cutting ourselves off from reality. Mm-hmm. Is that too strong of a way to say that?
No, I think that's a really good way to put it. And I appreciated what you said, addressing in the latter half of what you said, criticizing the reject it all approach, which is you rooted it in the fact that, culture is created by people and people are image bearers, which means as image bearers, we, in a very imperfect way, nonetheless, image God in some way, aspect, or form, right? Which means culture cannot ultimately be fully bad because it comes from God. Right. I mean, in the sense that human beings are made in the likeness of God, and we are creatures that are made as worshiping creatures, and as we engage in the world around us, we cultivate life, and so it can't all be bad, and that's I think the mistake that I think those who say, "Well, I'm just going to remove myself from culture or reject culture altogether," make is that you neglect the fact that there is something to be redeemed here, because God didn't just create everything all terrible; He actually made things to be good. Right. So the problem isn't in the existence of culture. The problem is in the fact that sinful, fallen creatures participate in culture and cultivate things in the world that do not accurately represent God.
Right.
And so...
Well, let's make the distinction. God does not create culture. God creates humanity who creates culture.
Correct.
Yes. And because humanity is made in the image and likeness of God, therefore people have the ability to image and reflect God, meaning displaying His characteristics, His attributes, His heart. Yeah. And though people are fallen, they do that imperfectly, but they do that nonetheless to some degree. Right. So whether someone is a believer or an unbeliever, they have the ability to create culture, which will not be perfect because they're fallen, and yet will not be totally, utterly depraved because they still remain image bearers who are reflecting God to some degree.
Who have received some degree of grace.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And so within we would say the spectrum of culture,
Right.
Yeah.
we see all different manner of fallenness and imaging
Yeah.
that takes place,
Right.
right? So
Right.
there's this spectrum,
Yep.
which means we can't just completely accept it all or reject it all.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Okay, that's good. That's helpful. So, how do we approach it then? Right. I mean, so there's Leslie Nubian. Did I say it right?
I think so.
According
Okay.
to Peter, you said it right.
Leslie Nubian, who kind of came up with this framework, which is, I think, really helpful. Right. Which is, this is the framework. There are some aspects in culture that we can accept. There are some aspects of culture we need to redeem, and there are some aspects of culture we need to reject. So when it comes to thinking through, how do you as a believer engage in culture, I find that framework to be really helpful. Right. So let's maybe talk about those three aspects. Right. When it comes to as believers, there are things that we can accept. What does that look like? What are those things, and what does that look like?
Well, music, right? Art, various forms of it that aren't necessarily, they're morally neutral. They're not, either they're not necessarily evil or virtuous per se, but they're expressions of image bearers, right? So, if, like, for example, I look at music as something that is beautiful and wonderful that you should accept. And then again, if you're looking at aspects of music that are communicating things that are falsehoods or lies about who God is and who we are in light of who He is, well, then those are things that we need to either reject or redeem. But in terms of accepting things, I think if you think of morally neutral things that aren't, if you look at them just in and of themselves, well, they're part of God's creation.
Right. You're almost zooming back and talking about categories. Music as a
as a category.
Art as
Correct.
a category.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I think you're making a good distinction, which is when it comes to culture and the categories of culture, I would say most, because right now I can't think about every potential possibility. So everything I can think of right now is regarding a category morally neutral.
Right.
Right. So like music, morally neutral.
Right.
Film, morally neutral.
Right.
Art in its various kinds, whether it's paintings or sculptures or written form, poetry, stories, whatever it is, morally neutral.
Right.
Right. When it comes to, because culture would also include government structures.
Right. Building institutions.
Building institutions, morally neutral. So, unless there's some kind of ideology which just happens to totally be at odds with the heart and character of God, then obviously that's not necessarily morally neutral, because it's an ideology that's trying to propagate some kind of falsehood. But most categories most likely are morally neutral.
Right.
So then what does that mean? It means that they're going to be, depending on who the person is that's creating that form of culture, they're expressing themselves in a certain way. And so we have to look at what is the expression.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
And
What is the
that's where I think Leslie Newbegin's system comes into play.
Yeah.
Right. So you first have to understand that creation, raw material that God has given to humanity, is amoral. And then what the creatures do with that creates a particular kind of culture that then you have to employ Leslie Nubian's system to go, okay, what do I do?
Right. So that's good, because if we're looking at it and we're going, okay, well, there's certain, we could say certain, we'll just use art, because I think art or film or something like that, or story is pretty easy to wrap our heads around. So let's just say, if we're looking at a story that portrays, a plot line and, character development, and it shows, tension, and a story can even show the fall. It can show people, doing things they ought not do. It can show elements of redemption and characters learning and growing and changing. It can have all of that piece to it, and we can step back at it and we can analyze that form of culture, that story, And we can say, you know what, there are elements of this story that I can accept. You know, there may be elements, though, of this story that, you know, need to be redeemed. Like by chance, like say, for example, like maybe someone puts something in the story that they're saying this is like a fact or reality that's not true. It's like a lie. Okay, well, maybe that needs to be redeemed somehow.
Right.
Or there may be things in the story that are portrayed as this is the way, which we need to reject because it's not the way.
Right.
You know?
Right.
You know, so like, so even if you think about like, you know, okay, so think about like the category of sexuality. Okay, so God created sexuality. God gives sexuality to humanity to be enjoyed within a particular context.
Right.
That context being one man, one woman in the context of marriage.
Right.
So sex is a gift to be enjoyed within the context of, you know, monogamous covenant marriage. And anything outside of God's design is a distortion of what God intends sexuality to be. Right. So certain things, we would look at culture and we could say, well, certain things like pornography, for example, we'd say, well, that's not something that we can redeem because it goes at odds with God's created order. It goes at odds with what God intends sexuality to be. And so it's something we need to reject.
Yes.
Right. But if there's, you know, there could be, you know, the idea that, you know, a husband and wife are intimate in various forms, and we could look at that and, well, not look at it as in watch it, but we could look at the idea
of sexual expression.
Of like, yes, that's a good thing. That's a God-given gift.
Yes.
And we can affirm that.
Yes.
Because it's in the way God intended it to be.
Well, that's what God does with sexuality. He redeems it, right? So he takes that which he actually gave as a gift, and human beings, fallen human beings who corrupted it, right? As Christians, what do? We look at sexuality through the lens of God's redemptive work. So he takes that which he has created that was meant to be a good gift, and then he redeems that for his people to be used in the way that he intended it to be, right? And so I think that's a great example.
Yeah, I think something that you just brought up is really helpful in terms of talking about, is it a thing that actually sets us against the will or desires or intentions of God? And if participating in something like requires you to have this either heart disposition or in some way participate in something that is against the will and desires of God, I think that's one way in which we can say, that's a thing that must be rejected. You know, I think of Genesis 11, building the tower at Babel, or Tower of Babylon. It's the same word as Babylon. Like, here's a bunch of people who have come together and said, let's take God's place. Let's build a tower all the way up to the heavens so that we can rule from the heavens like God is supposed to. A Christian could not be in that culture and say, well, I think we can redeem this whole tower situation. No.
Let's redeem our attempts of dethroning God.
A Christian needs to go tear down that tower.
Yeah.
Because that tower must be rejected.
An idea
that cultural monument is against the will and purposes of God. Go back a few chapters. Who establishes the first city in the Bible? It's Cain. Man who's just murdered his brother, then goes, starts a family, and establishes the first city in the Bible. Well, does living in a city require us to be against God and his purposes? No, there are people in cities all over the place who can work together, who actually can benefit from being together in a city to work together for the mission of God. And so
you reject a city because Cain built it?
Exactly.
That's kind of the idea.
Exactly. Do we reject a city because we don't like the government in it? Well, no, it actually can be redeemed, because there's a difference between something that is in its essence opposed to God and something that is being wielded by fallen people who are opposed to God.
There's a difference. It's a big difference.
The tower and the city. Like, Christian can't build that tower to Babel, or tower at Babel. Just can't. Not while living in line with God's purposes.
Correct.
A Christian can live in a city and work in various ways to
Yes.
redeem the city.
Yeah. Right. And build buildings
build
that don't have a
buildings.
purpose of dethroning God.
Right.
Right. Like the Tower of Babel was.
Right.
I would really like that distinction, because you know what that means. And practically, it means if there's someone who, maybe even someone who outspokenly has been like, I don't believe in God, or I don't like God, or I'm against God, and yet if they make something, whether it's like a form of art or something, and it actually is beautiful and reflects beautiful things, as in it's not against the will of God, but it's reflecting some beautiful things, you could say, I don't necessarily agree with this person's view on God, at least at this point in their life, right? Because you never know, a person might change over time.
Right.
But you could say, but I can actually appreciate what they've made. And you could even, as a believer, say, if they were making something that you could participate in, you might even be able to say, like, and I could participate in this way.
Right.
Right.
Which I think is really important, because sometimes what happens, as I've seen this, Christians just immediately write off an entire expression of culture, or even write off a person, because they're like, well, I don't agree with what this person says or thinks, so I'm not going to even do any kind of like collaboration or partnership with them.
Right.
Right.
And it's like, well, but you're kind of missing an opportunity, and you're missing the point.
Right. I think it also misses the point that nobody is entirely on the receiving end of culture. Like sometimes I think when we start having this conversation among Christians, we say, oh, well, should we accept it or should we reject it, as if culture only ever happens out there and it's only ever something that we receive and then we have to decide what to do with it. But the biblical mandate for God's people is actually to create culture, to form culture, and to shape culture. And so that's where, that redemption piece becomes really important, because otherwise all we're doing is reacting to what the world throws at us.
Right.
And inevitably, we're going to look like one extreme or the other, because we accept all these things and we reject all these things. And then we don't actually look like the kingdom of God,
I love that.
That's true.
Bring heaven on earth, like Jesus talks about. Like, we actually have to see, okay, there is culture, hundreds, thousands of years of culture that we're receiving, and we can't do anything about that. But we're not just passive. Oh, well, I guess this is what we have to work with, and we either have to accept it or reject it. Like, no, we have to also have a place to say we can, with God's help and by God's grace, create something new and partner with Christ in the work of redemption in this.
I love that. What I love about that is, God gives us spiritual gifts and natural talents, and we can learn to exercise our gifts through the power of the Spirit. We can cultivate those natural talents to grow in them, and as we do that, we can actually build and shape culture, which means, especially as Christians, like, we need to be engaging not just with the culture that's been made. We need to be engaging in such a way to create culture. Right? We need more Christian artists, right, who are going to shape and renew what art looks like in the future. We need more Christian filmmakers who are going to be telling like beautiful stories,
truthful stories.
We need more Christian, authors. We need more Christian, architects. We need more people in all the various ways of culture making to be more engaged and more shaping and building culture more and more and more.
Yeah, and as a Christian, that all of that is informed of your relationship with God. I mean, worship is all encompassing. It encompasses your whole life. What you think about God, what you believe about God, how you see God, how you relate to God, impacts how you then begin to use the things that God has given you to cultivate culture in the world, right? And I mean, make no mistake, what we believe about God impacts actually what we're trying to communicate with culture, right? It does. I mean, I remember watching a documentary on Amazon Prime by Francis Schaeffer titled "How Should We Then Live?" And he actually talked about this idea of you can use culture to communicate truths about who God is and what the world is like. And he gave this example of, this artist who's trying to create this collage of just chaos and disorder to try to communicate something about the universe. The irony, however, though, is as the camera zooms out, you see buckets of paint that are moving in orderly, organized concentric circles, creating this chaos. So it's like you can't escape certain realities about who God is. Even if you're trying to communicate lies, you're still borrowing and using things that God has actually given so that you could use to glorify him and actually communicate truth about him. And so I think that's the mission of believers in the world, is to take everything that God has made and to use it for, and this is how we would describe it, use it for the glory of God.
Right.
And the good of humanity. That's the mission of humanity to the world. And so, so.
That's good. How about let's talk about one last thing, and then we'll wrap it up. Discernment. Okay, so I think maybe it would be helpful to kind of hit on that a little bit. So I'll give an example of a way discernment can play out, and then maybe we can either talk about that or you can add to it or whatnot. But so I love to watch movies. I like all different genres of movies. Yeah, right. I like them all, except for musicals. Okay. I'm not a big fan of musicals.
Are you a musical guy, Dima?
Okay.
You know what? No, I'm not a musical guy. I'm not a musical guy. I tried really hard to think of a musical that I enjoyed or watched, and nothing came to mind.
That's right, because you're a godly man.
That's right. Because I have discernment.
Well, just kidding. Come on,
We'll move on before you ask me then.
That's right.
So when it comes to movies, right? Genres of movies, I don't watch movies passively.
Oh yeah.
Right. To where I'm just whatever they say, I just agree with whatever it is. I just take it in.
Yeah.
Right.
Like I when I watch movies, I'm thinking like, who are these people? What are these characters? What are they about? What do they say? What about them is inconsistent? What are lies? I'm thinking about what is the story communicating? I'm even thinking like who the person who wrote this movie, what are they trying to communicate? What about the director and the different actors and how they portray the characters and the kinds of shots and images and everything that they're doing? So it's like as I'm watching a movie, I may immerse myself in the storyline, but I don't just accept it and allow it to shape my worldview because I'm not passively just digesting and whatever you say, that's what goes. No, I'm actively analyzing and I'm discerning. And there are movies that are some of my favorite movies that I just do not agree with the premise of the movie or like the ideology of the movie.
Right, sure.
But I can appreciate the art form of the movie. Right. And I think what gives a person the ability to do that is discernment, right? And that's something that as believers we all have the ability to have discernment. That the Spirit of God will give us discernment. Yeah, and sometimes what that means is you're watching something and you're going, I don't agree with this, but I'm going to allow myself to still, appreciate this form of art. And there are certain aspects that I'm going to reject. But I need to understand what's going on here. In particular, as pastors, when people are like watching certain movies or they're talking about certain things, there are times when, I don't know if you guys have done this, but I've been like, I'm not really interested in that movie, but I'll go and watch it because so many people are talking about it. I feel like I need to understand what that is about so that if someone asks me a question about it or if someone wants to talk about it, I actually have an informed idea of what it is. And so I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes...
Obviously it's something though, that is potentially redeemable, right? It's not like, oh, hey, I got to go try this sin out to see how to understand.
Right.
Yeah,
I'm not talking about
saying that.
I'm not talking about that.
You're talking about something that you can engage with discerningly,
Right.
and
something that does not need to be rejected outright.
Yeah,
There are certain
things that can potentially be redeemable.
Yeah, they're redeemable. So like there are certain genres of film that like snuff films or something like that. It's like that's not redeemable. Right, like there. I'm not going to feed myself with those kinds of things. There's certain genres of a film where you just go like, well, I'm not going to go and watch all that stuff because I need to understand it. It's like, no, I know what the premise of this is, and I have to reject it.
Right.
But the vast majority, right? I would say the vast majority of film is something that's on a spectrum of that fallenness spectrum or that imaging spectrum.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sometimes
I even ask myself too about this idea of what impression has this film left me with? Like what beliefs, attitudes,
questions.
Questions that it's cultivated in me.
Yeah.
Right? That's a good way to process discernment. Sometimes you'll watch a film and it's like there's nothing inherently bad in it, but then at the end of the day, you're left with this impression of a lie about who you are, or a lie about who God is, or a lie about whatever, right? And then you're like, man, hold on, whoa, I got to step back a second and go, like, what did this just communicate?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because even like as a parent, like we've always done this. Our boys are older now, but when they were younger and we would watch Disney movies or Pixar movies, it'd be like we would literally sit there with the remote control, and as the movie was happening, there'd be times we would pause it and we'd say, okay, let's talk about what just happened here. Yeah. And we would have a conversation about what's happening in the storyline in this movie, because those movies, as entertaining as they are filled with a lot of distortions and lies, and there's all kinds of little things that they oftentimes will put in there. And so we didn't reject them as parents. We said we're going to watch them with our children and engage in them, and we're going to use them as a training tool. So as we would go through the movies, we would stop and talk and try to teach our children how to have discernment so that they can watch not passively but actively when they engage with different types of not just stories, but
we've been
like
doing this. We've been trying to do the same thing. We have Friday night movie night, and we'll sit there, watch a movie together as a family, and we'll just point out, just pause. Yeah, why did he say that? Or why did they do that? Why did he or she do that? What is that right? And then it's get them to think about it, not just give them the answer to, but get them to ask questions and then engage them and go, hey, this is why it's, help them see the logical conclusion of that.
I think when you're talking about discernment and when you're talking about leading your family or engaging with another person, I'm like, what's actually going on here? It kind of comes back to the issue of worship, which is something you brought up before we started recording. You said, what was it you said? Worship is upstream.
It's upstream from culture, yeah.
I love that worship comes first. And the way that you're engaging with those movies is informed by your worship and your convictions that you hold, or the way that you engage with your family. One time we were watching Moana, like when it had first come out with, we were in California, and
You're
with
welcome.
it was it that song? Is that the one where Maui is introduced? And we were watching it with one of our associate pastor and his family, and he had little kids at the time. And like his 4 or 5-year-old kid, when Maui starts singing about being a demigod, stood up and was like, that guy's lying. He's not God. Only
God.
Jesus is God. And this 5-year-old had his worship upstream from his engagement with culture. And he was calling out the lies in Moana. And I was like, good. Joshua, come on, man. You better say it. But I think that's so important. How do we have that discernment? Well, we're not going to have it if we're not actively engaged in worship first and in fixing our eyes on Christ. 2 Corinthians 3 talks about beholding him with unveiled faces and beholding his glory and being transformed from one degree of glory to the next. And it's only if we have our eyes fixed on his glory are we going to be shaped by him more than culture. Only if we have that upstream.
Yeah.
Right.
That's so good. That is, we'll stop right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that. You just
I want to keep
landed-
going.
that's
Come
You
on.
landed the plane.
Well, I'll just say just
So-
one last thing.
No, you
I
can't.
think what we
You
can
can't.
all agree on
But you
that
just-
needs to be rejected is country music.
I plead the fifth. We're done. That's it.
I just wanted to end on that note because I think it's important because
Thank you for that.
it's terrible.
So, we hope that you take something from this conversation.
I don't endorse that.
And we want you to exercise discernment as you engage with culture. And we also want to encourage you to shape and create culture.
Yeah.
So that you can get more and more the image of God out there in society. And all of that begins with worship. It continues with worship. And at the end of it all is still more worship,
Right.
worshiping Jesus.
There it is. Classic 28-minute, 20-minute conversation.
It was actually longer than that because I forgot to like.
30
That's why I was trying to wrap it up
30-minute
because
conversation.
it was like 30 minutes. So
What else is supposed to happen when you get three pastors around a table?